Your
Yeah,
story.
yeah, sure thing. You know, the article and the story that I narrate in that space, I think is an event that transcends into a relationship that's transforming me. I do think it actually stands on the shoulders of lots of years of struggling to try to figure out how to bridge difference and how to do that across racial and ethnic lines, how to do that across creedal lines and divides, how to do that across sexual orientation divides, economic divides. I think I come into even the writing of that particular story, which was the first time I've had the opportunity to sit down and think it out and write it down. So thanks for the opportunity to do that. Recognizing that like as a practitioner have been stumbling my way into bridging difference, into crossing divides. And I imagine that with the ever-changing landscape that we will be navigating the rest of our lives, we always need to be approaching this from the posture of learners, you know, like what worked in some of the ways in which I've attempted to cross difference or cross divides in racial and ethnic spaces may or may not work in the way that in this story as it unfolded. I'm crossing a divide that's been shaped by political ideology and even theology. So I think I come into the writing of that story and even into this space as a learner, very much so in process, and but also tenaciously evaluative because I want to do this better. I want to spend the rest of my life fueled by my faith, bridging difference, crossing divides, growing the reach of my empathy, and expanding the circle of my human concern. And because I actually think that's the essence of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, who clearly crossed a divide for the sake of liberation, transformation, restoration. And so the article itself, the story is, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, is one that happened by accident. And in my social location, of course, we're in the US, I would say that we're a wildly polarized environment right now, especially politically. And the way that I share the story is that I had been engaged in political advocacy, in frontline protest experiences, in lots of organizing in Central Oregon, where we boast one of the most heavily condensed populations of white nationalist militia groups here in my social location. And so the political and ideological divide that is very much so undergirded by theology is not just trafficked in ideas and thoughts. It's supported through violence, through the presence of intimidation, like big guns and big trucks and offensive flags and things like this. And so I had been embedded in the protest movements, contending with those who had been disadvantaged by power for a long time, by inequitable uses of power for a long time. Learning to even in the midst of that absorb the violence of the state on behalf of those who have been for generations. And I was exhausted. And so and we're also in the midst of the pandemic. It's when we didn't know anything about COVID-19. And if you like breathed next to somebody, you might get this. And so many uncertainties. Then there's the racial uprising and the next revolution with the losses of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. All of that is roiling in our space. And then you have the political upheaval that I don't need to share with you is very real and very intense and quite violent in North America, or United States. So all of that had me into a place where I was exhausted. I needed a change of scenery. So I took my family camping. I did so in the middle of the wilderness because I didn't want to be around any people. I needed a breath, and went like no sooner had we gotten the camp set up than I hear another big diesel truck, which is a sound of some of the violence that we'd been experiencing in the protest movement. A big diesel truck pulls up right next to me with all sorts of the political stickers, and it was off-putting to me. I got away from these people on purpose, and realized as they were pulling up, my disdain for who it was that was pulling next to us probably indicated that I had fabricated an enemy. And through a series of events, mostly including my daughter, who is an incredible organizer and friend maker, I say in the article that I saw them as an inconvenience. She saw them as an opportunity to make new friends. And so that's the disposition of my daughter. And so she organized the kids, is so polite and incredible. And these two people crossed the divide to us. So I'd like to be able to say that I crossed the divide to them, but it didn't happen that way. They crossed the divide to us because they wanted to understand who the parents were of this extraordinary young woman. And as they crossed, their guns were on their hips. There was tobacco in the bottom lips. There were shirts with pretty offensive political statements on it. And it kickstarted a relationship that's changing my life. And so that's what I unpack then in this article, most notably around how I reflect on how good I am, how efficient I am at fabricating false narratives and fables about the people that I choose to other an enemy, how efficient I am at keeping them beyond the reach of my empathy. But then I also, I reflect on the conviction of realizing that anybody who exists beyond the reach of my empathy is my enemy. And that's a quote by my dear friend Oshita Moore in Shalom Sisters. And I don't have an option when it comes to enemies, right? Because I follow a Jesus who took us beyond neighbor love to enemy love. So the relationship itself has forced me to understand not only how do I cross difference, bridge difference, but how good am I at concocting and fabricating enemies and then holding them beyond the reach of my empathy? I have to figure out how to tend to that work if I'm actually going to bridge difference in a way that doesn't try to conquer them or convert them, but in a way that actually transforms me, maybe transforms them, and awakens our imaginations to new possibilities.
Thanks, Jer. I feel like I can sense the questions in our virtual room like looming. So I've got a couple for you as a warm up. But everybody else, please feel free to start to put your questions into the chat, and we'll draw on them after this. So do feel free to start putting some of those cute questions in the chat. Okay, so there's a few things that you talk a lot about the different kind of divides, which is actually, you painted quite a dynamic and colourful picture for us in terms of the different aspects or different kinds of divides that are true for you in your community that I'm sure are highly relatable, some more than others for different people in different places. One of the things that you touched on there and that you said in your article, which I've been really challenged by and would like to hear your views on, is this idea about constructing enemies, and you use the word there around like fables and fallacy almost. But I'm wondering, is that something that is active in me, in most of us, in all of us, and how can we find that in ourselves, or what are the things that help us realize that actually we might be constructing enemies actively without really realizing it, or without knowing that we are, until something hits us, like it did, something came in front of you that meant, okay, you have to process these, you have to manage this. Yeah. And especially if we don't have that moment of encounter, how can we realize that might be active in us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm struck by the notion that whenever and wherever there's an us, there's a them. And oftentimes in social dynamics, relationships, our usness oftentimes actually demands a them. Like we rally around a them, even, take it to a sporting level. Choose your favorite football team, and there's the us, and there clearly is the them, and part of our passion is connected to the fact that there's a them and we have to destroy them. And so I only know of one other community where the usness is not contingent upon or requires a themness. And that's the community that Jesus is actually building. I think that the community that Jesus is building turns the pronouns into plural inclusive pronouns. There is us, period. And so for me, as I've taken this journey in the direction of the integration of faith and leadership and justice, peacemaking, as you take this journey, you find your people. You find your people who are fueled by their faith or not into the trenches of peacemaking and reconciliation, trying to destabilize unjust status quos and trying to bring about new ways of thinking about the way that we are together. And just simply by living in those spaces, the stories that we tell ourselves about them are eloquent, are contagious. And I have a wild imagination. And so when I'm sitting, whether I'm listening to something, I'm observing something, I'm in a protest movement, I'm in an environment where there are different groups of people, it's amazing to me when I'm actually cognizant of it, how wildly creative and efficient I am about telling myself stories about that person or about them, And so part of my process has been just holding myself accountable to paying attention to how quickly I make up a story about you and why you are the way that you are. I pay attention to actually how HD that story is. Like, I'm not just kind of creating some sort of esoteric idea. It's like I'm concocting a fable that includes like real examples of things that you have done to become the way that you are and believe the way that you believe. And I don't even know you. So it's just amazing how our imagination has actually been conditioned to generate others and enemies. And so for me, this relationship in particular is really causing me to interrogate that and to get it to be honest with myself in terms of how efficient I am, and begin to articulate this. So part of my practice, especially with the friend that I talk about, is I will say things like, the story that I've made up is, can you help me understand its accuracy, or help me understand how I'm seeing this differently? So like, it's a confessional way of saying, I've made up a story about you. It's probably not 20/20 vision. Help me get clearer on my understanding of you, but I'm not going to be the one holding the pen. I'm going to let you hold the pen because it's your story. And so there's so it's, on the one hand, it's keeping myself accountable and interrogating this and paying attention to how good I am at it. And on the other hand, it's in the context of these relationships, actually confessing it through that device. Like, I've made up this story, or you just did a thing that contradicts a story that I've created in my mind about you, and in a moment of affirmation or whatever it is. And what I've found is that that's actually not offensive to them. They actually appreciate the fact that I'm giving them the pen and letting them tell their own story. Now I might agree or disagree with some of the values of their story or some of the conclusions they've come to, but they're holding the pen and they're helping me actually understand them more fully. Carrie, is that helpful at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting how you put it into a confessional kind of framework. That I think that's really interesting. And it's really easy to find out one piece of information about someone and therefore assume a lot of other things. They vote this, they probably think they shop this, or they read that newspaper, they probably think this about XYZ. And I think that's at least what that's one of those things that actually we can catch ourselves, or hold ourselves in a reflective manner to go, oh, that's interesting. And Anne's asked a question which I think relates a bit to what you're saying there, which is she's put it almost, you talked about constructing enemies, and said like sometimes we delight in that, and you referenced almost being a bit wired to do that. Why do you think that is? Anne's question. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean,
we delight in constructing enemies.
Yeah, I mean, in my carnal flesh, I love to win. I love to prove my superiority over you. I even take this back. This isn't something that we get socialized into when we're older. I think this habit of creating fables about others and enemies is something that happens on the playgrounds when we're kids. Or in my case, I grew up between a dairy farm and a military base in Midwest Wisconsin. And the first active military campaign that I can remember was called Operation Desert Storm, where we invaded Iraq because they invaded Kuwait. And I began to collect and trade Desert Storm trading cards, like baseball cards, or I don't know if you know what I'm saying? Like, I literally collected the set that deified our generals and our missiles and our destroyers. And like, I knew the name of every one of our aircraft carriers and things like this. Then fast forward the clock to 2001, when I watch airplanes fly into buildings probably 10,000 times, because that's the way that we construct our enemies. Because nationally, we need an enemy in order to feel like we're useful or we're important. We have to set ourselves in opposition to somebody else. And so, like, in the 2001 era, I had already grown up into a faith and a politic that deified military. Literally, my understanding was that our military is God's righteous right hand. I was socialized to believe that. Then I see planes crash into buildings thousands of times. And even as at that point, like a 21-year-old, I bought into the myth that Muslims are our collective enemy. And that the fact that we had that enemy gave us a sense of purpose and a sense of value, and it increased our passion for saviorism. You know, there's a billion things that actually did. So I think, yeah, it feels good. There's advantages to having an enemy and then feeling more powerful than them. I think the problem, and I think the invitation into enemy love, is that the Jesus that I follow is not interested in shows of power in order to build a better way. The Jesus that I follow built a movement around powerlessness and self-sacrifice as the way to actually find purpose and meaning and transformation, liberation, restoration, right? So we've bought, I think, at least in Western culture, North American, US American culture, we've bought this lie that I need an enemy in order to feel valuable, in order to feel valiant, when in fact, I think we're invited into a revolution that's based on the redistribution of power or powerlessness, self-sacrifice for the sake of others. That's where we find our meaning, and that's where we find our community, right? So we've been sold this. I think it's actually antithetical to the way of Jesus, and it's time that we begin to explore this as a more viable option.
I mean, I feel like there's a whole nother book or chapter or articles between 21-year-old Jer and today.
Oh, for sure.
You know, some of what, you know, it might take in terms of how you're describing your socialization through to where you are now. We've got a lot of really good questions, so I think I'll ask my final one and then we can turn to the questions in the chat. So I said at the start, we talk a lot about these three habits of being curious, being present, and reimagining. And I'm wondering, in your relationship that you describe in your article, like, did you see any of those in play? Did anything feel like really important in particular that you needed to practice in order to cross this divide?
Yeah. I think I guess one of the things I've been reflecting on, even since being given the opportunity to tell this story, is how I still have a disposition in me that crossing the divides is a means to convincing somebody else of the superiority of my ideas, or of my values, or of my lifestyle, or of my creed, or whatever it is. Like, that too has been ingrained in, which is a power over approach. And I think what's changing for me slowly, and I hope the pace of this transformation accelerates, because it feels good, true, and beautiful, is that I'm beginning to recognize that the impulse, or maybe the outcome of bridging difference or crossing divides, is my transformation. Do you get what I mean? Like, what if our crossing divides is not to change someone else, but to be undone and remade? How would that change the way that we do this? How would that inform the questions we ask as we embody this value of curiosity? How would it adjust the way that we're present, in the way that we offer unprecedented hospitality with our bodies, with our words, with our homes, with our dinner tables, like the invitations that we less maybe offer and more accept? You know, maybe we know when we're effectively crossing difference when we begin to receive invitations to nearness, to presence, you know, and the way that I'm present communicates to that person that that our friendship matters to me, that I have something to learn and benefit from this time. And it's only in that I think the reimagining can happen. Because if I don't trust, if I don't trust you and you don't trust me, we're not going to imagine together. That's some intimate space, honestly. And so if I'm crossing the divide between us towards you, and I'm doing it to be transformed, not that you are a means to my transformation, but the relationship is, I'm trusting that the relationship will be transformative to me. I'm actually watching that build the kind of trust between us where the imagining or the reimagining can actually occur. Because the fact of the matter is, as we get curious and get present, and we do so with a transformational impulse, we begin to actually find our commonality. We begin to understand that we share some values to actually do some imagining around. We actually invite each other to imagine how the way that we're living out our values might not be beneficial to very many people, you know? And so I think there's a disposition that we need to hold, a commitment, a desire that we will demand of ourselves in the work of crossing divides that is about transformation. And let's say my transformation more so than their transformation. And if we can hold that, perhaps our collective transformation actually will start to take foot. So yeah, I think that's how I'm trying to live out this relationship with the friend whose story that I share. I'm genuinely invested in his life and why he thinks the way he thinks. And I understand his values now. Now the curiosity is about how those values were shaped. Right. And but I'm also wildly curious about his kids and his relationship with his partner. And I'm curious about his work, and I'm celebrating his wins because I know about them, because I've asked about them, you know. And it took 2.5 years before they invited us to their property for a barbecue, you know. And this guy is more heavily armed than most countries in the world. And so it's weird to kind of enter into this space where there's guns everywhere and I've got little kids, and, you know, but to be invited by them to share a meal with them, that's some sacred stuff. That's like the crossing of divides has happened or is happening. And there's the currency of trust that's there, you know.
It's lovely. And right up at the start in some of the chat and the questions, Janet asked a little bit, could you tell us a bit more about the initial conversations that you had? Like, how did that go down? Like, right.
Yeah. I honestly, it was all very, you know, at the campground, it was all very much so around bow hunting with bows and arrows. And, you know, like the fact of the matter is, when the pandemic hit, I mean, my work takes me into war zones, whether they're boardrooms or battlefields, and I'm working with people in high intense moments. And COVID meant that I couldn't travel into those spaces the same way. So I realized that I need to find something where it's dangerous, high probability of failure in order to feel alive. And in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, it's hunting because you're on the food chain. And I'm not interested in hunting with guns, but bow hunting, there's a challenge, you know? And so it was a lot, like our initial conversations were just about the realities of this, because he's an expert at it and I'm not, which I think is a really key factor here for how we enter into these conversations. Is it's important for me to identify the topic that I have so much to learn from, because I want to be able to position myself as a learner as quickly as possible. So with him, when I actually came to him and said, I don't even really know how to shoot this, it gave him the opportunity to be like, I have something to offer you. You know, same thing then in exploring the mountains with him and beginning to learn about this. I was the learner, and I'm used to being in places where I offer input, you know, and so, but I'm also in spaces regularly where I am the student and I don't have anything to offer. So I just applied that to this relationship. And I just asked a ton of questions about the thing that we shared in common. That's where it began. And it probably lived in that space until the moment when we were sitting around the fire and he said, "Hey, I've been researching you online. What are you?" And that changed the conversation. And what it did is we didn't talk a lot more right away. Like this has to move at the pace of trust, right? Like this is not bridging difference or crossing divides. You can't fast track this stuff. This has to move at the pace of trust. And that was a really significant moment that opened some doors to deeper conversations. But the next day after that fireside chat, he began to open up his life and like what it's been like to navigate his wife's journey with alcoholism. He began to open up what it's been like to father a son who's severely autistic, right? And so and that became the content of our conversations. All the while I'm listening for values. So navigating with your wife through her journey through alcoholism, I'm listening to like that's a high level commitment that he has to this woman, like covenant love type of stuff. I'm interested in that. I want to go to the value place, or like fathering a heavily autistic son. I'm not just hearing that story. I want to dive into the values. What's the values? Like, what's that changing in you as you're doing this, right? So it's as the conversation unfolds, it's moving it beyond just the telling of the stories to deepening it to like, what are the values that drive you, and how is that story transforming you? How's it changing you? How's it deepening you? How's it changing your perspective? Things like this. Ultimately, we get to things like your reflections on the insurrection on January 6th, when a whole bunch of folks, his folks with big guns, stormed our Capitol. Now it took 3 years of relationship and proximity, presence, curiosity to be able to have the kind of trust where I could ask him, tell me your perspective on this, so eventually at the right time, it moves into those spaces.
Okay. So there's a question here from Martha, which is, okay, so Jer, you could be described as potentially a professional peacemaker, right? This
Sure.
is part of your vocation. Yeah. So for you to seek with all of what you've just described, it means to cross divides. You can go like, okay, but what about him? So like, why on earth has he bothered to cross divides with you? Which is some of what Martha's question is, which is, as you have experience of movement breaking down the divide, do you think that the other, quote, has?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on how we define when a divide has been crossed, right? He invites me to be with him as often as he possibly can. And he has, like, as he's opened doors into all sorts of other relationships with white militia dudes, like I'm in some unique rooms right now with some unique people who have a very different understanding of democracy than I do. Say frequently is, this is my very progressive friend and he loves my kids, right? So I love his kids. That's the thing. That's the thing that matters to him more than our ideological difference. Now, I don't consider myself a wildly progressive, but compared to him, I am the most progressive person that he has dared to be in a friendship with, that fleshes itself out in lots of invitations and then brokering invitations, because somehow this relationship is deepening something in him. And I don't even know if he can articulate it. I don't know if I can articulate it, but it's enough that he's beginning to broker other relationships, because he's like, I think he's saying something good happens when I'm next to this guy. And so if I'm gauging, if that's my metric, I think he's coming toward me, keeping in mind he was the first one to cross the divide into relationship with me, and I've seen him continue to do that.
Nice. Okay, so Diana asked us, we have a few questions here, Jer. So do you feel that the process of empathy can also lead to division? If empathy has limits, then those limits within the limit are okay, but those beyond are still othered. So does it run out?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. There are times when I want to walk away. but I mean, I think maybe let me take it in this direction. I'm not sure that empathy means agreement, you know. So I don't know, like empathy is, in my view, empathy is to be so in tune with another that I literally feel the pain that they're feeling. Which is of course different than sympathy, where I can notice and feel sad about a thing that's happening to you. But empathy is when I feel with you. I'm suffering with you in this. And I think it's been my experience, limited as it has been. I think my experience is that the capacity of my empathy grows through this level of solidarity, and it probably ebbs and sways. And there are times when my empathy is very thin, I would imagine, and there are times when it's a bit deeper. I find that my empathy grows with consistency and proximity, and then the way that it manifests is situational, you know. Yeah, and like I remember I lost my dad 4 years ago to cancer, and I remember in the pandemic, his dad fell ill, and they were really concerned, and he reached out to me, and I just held that with him, and I grieved with him. Now, that's what empathy looked like in that moment, which again is an intimate and vulnerable space, which requires a high currency of trust. So I don't think empathy is agreement. I don't think empathy means that we have to compromise. I don't think empathy means that people just get a free pass to do whatever they want to do. Empathy for me, because I'm also empathetic with people who suffer by the lived ethic of people who hold some of the ideology that he holds. And so I'm empathetic with him, but I'm also empathetic with people who are suffering by unequal distributions of power. And so in the currency of trust, like when empathy meets empathy, I can actually bring some perspective from empathy here, because I have empathy for him, and I actually do want to see him transform. I want to see him actually grow in his understanding of the implications of an ethic connected to an ideology. So sometimes the empathy looks that way, you know. So I don't mean to be dodgy. I think empathy is hard to pin down. And I'm trying to be honest about the fact that it ebbs and sways, but always grows in solidarity.
Oh, yeah, it's lovely. Jane says, what are some of the ways that would help minimize divides in communities that are politically sensitive to come together due to the status quo? And I think that's interesting, because it's got a community aspect to that question as well. So beyond us as individuals. Yeah. I don't think that there's a more important piece of furniture in the kingdom of God than the table. And I think we need to actually be sharing tangible tables with one another a lot more frequently. One of the strategies that we deploy here is the shared table, and we invite people to bring. It's simple stuff. It's potluck style, peacemaking through potlucks, right? It's bring a dish that's been meaningful to your family's story to share. And we spend, of a 2-hour dinner, we spend 90% of the time hearing the stories of the people around the table as they're talking about that dish and the memories that it evokes. What that does is it actually starts to humanize people who are on the other side of the political divide. We spend so much time in like angry discourse about what we disagree on, and we forget that we're human beings trying to raise families or build a future or contribute to a better world or whatever it is. And so we've got to find, and I think we actually have to create some programmatic infrastructure like these shared tables, where we can step away from the intensity of the political jargon and actually crawl into each other's lives. And I think over here, we've really atrophied in our ability to do that, which means that we probably need a little bit more programmatic infrastructure than we needed 10 years ago. Guided conversation questions, or like bring the dish that's meaningful to your family to share, and be prepared to share that story. And all of a sudden we found out, wow, we spent 3 hours around a table and never really talked about presidential candidates or
you know.
Yeah.
Now that's not being dismissive of the realities of what need to happen. We just spend too much time screaming about these things, and we forget that we actually need to connect relationally. So there's an idea.
And then maybe last one from the chat, and we could see if anybody had a question that they wanted to ask that hasn't put it on the chat. William asks, I was taught that curiosity killed the cat. Should that affect our approach to being curious?
Maybe some more like, what does that mean? Curiosity kills the cat, or killed the cat?
I think like potentially the like relentless nature of like being curious.
I see. Sure. My safety isn't guaranteed. You know, like this story as it's unfolding puts me in close proximity with lots of people who have hip access to machines that are designed to propel metal through people's bodies so that I don't have to deal with you. Like, that's not safe. And everybody has a different threshold. I'm not saying that at the end of this call, we need to go find the most radical extremist friend we can build and like go, no, I don't think I have a unique disposition, and that's kind of, it's, I guess, happenstance to be my shtick, but it's not safe. I can't guarantee that this is safe. On the contrary, I can guarantee that crossing divides is dangerous, and that it's scary, and that it's costly. My experience over the last 20 years of crossing some of the divides that I talked about earlier in the call has cost me dearly. Publicly shamed, humiliated, because I'm building relationships with the wrong people according to a white evangelical orientation or understanding of who's right and who's wrong. You know, lost multiple opportunities to walk with people, excommunicated from communities because I've dared to cross differences. So I think the misnomer that this is easy and cost-free, let's just move beyond that right away. No, this is dangerous, and this will cost you. But is that not what we said yes to when we began to follow a cross-wearing God? You know. And so expect it. We need to grow some resilience, I think, as everyday peacemakers. Like, yeah. And there are moments where the conversation doesn't go well. You know, like there are moments when you'll actually attempt to cross difference, and people be like, get out of here. What we don't need is your voice around this. You know, so like, you'll experience those things. Does that cause us to quit? Or does that help us grow some resilience? And did we learn a couple things, and then we figure out how to do it again? You know, so I don't know. Curiosity maybe killed the cat. I mean, and it rarely goes well for peacemakers historically, you know, but I think we follow the peacemaker that's actually making all things new, and so it's worth my life.
Thanks, Jer.